Hey buds, Socialism Done Left here to review Anti-Capitalism is Anti-Vegan by the Unnatural Vegan. I don't know how far we're going to get into this, but we're going to see what she has to say.
I do think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan. A couple months ago, I did a Q&A, and one of the questions was about my political ideology, and I was asked if I considered myself neoliberal, and I said, yeah, I would consider myself neoliberal. And
before people hate too hard, the only thing I'll say is that neoliberal online can mean very different things than neoliberal in real life. Neoliberal online can mean fucking social democrat, like third way social democrat. Neoliberal offline means Thatcher and Reagan. So there's like a huge range of what neoliberal means. But it sounds like in this video, from what I recall, she's towards the like real world neoliberal, but we'll see.
And then I kind of gave a little bit more detail, expanded on that a bit in a follow-up Q&A, because the comments on the first one, people were kind of mad at me. It ranged from people confusing neoliberalism and libertarianism, they're not the same thing, to kind of like you're dead to me type comments for not opposing capitalism, even equating it to fascism, even saying that it was inconsistent with veganism. So I wanted to address it, the kind of extreme anti-capitalist sentiment and how that relates to veganism. Shouldn't be controversial. For those who don't know, neoliberal is like your typical left-leaning social progressive, but also being generally pro-free market with few restrictions on a lot of industries like housing, but also very pro-welfare state, as libertarians would say.
So it's free market welfare state. That's the one that she's promoting. I received a level 1 hype train emote. Thank you, Tony Zelica. Up then vegan gains. How does Hassan identify? Look, I don't want to hate her too much for being neoliberal. We need to actually critique her arguments, not just her ideology name, okay? Socialism Done Vegan. Yeah, so for reference, I am vegan, and I also am anti-capitalist, and I'm interested to see where she thinks the disjunct between the two is.
The liberals want a substantial safety net, often even supporting public options, like healthcare, for instance. Not all neoliberals do. Of course, there's going to be disagreement when the private options aren't serving the public. Conservatives often accuse neoliberals of being socialist because they accuse everyone of being socialist, advocating for higher taxation.
This is true, okay? She's right. Oh my God, based. True, she's right. The conservatives call everything socialist. True. Now let's see how she actually defends the meat of her argument.
Welfare, but ultimately the wealth in society that funds that welfare is generated by capitalist mechanisms. Same is the case in, what people call European socialism, which isn't really socialism by definition. Still relies on profit motive, still has...
True, she's correct that it isn't socialism. However, I would just take the basic Matt Brunig argument here that the amount of state ownership and the amount of state regulation and the amount of like labor power in these countries is so enormously larger than it is in countries like, say, the United States, that to a large degree, they aren't working under like a one-to-one equal model. And I think the general argument is that as we've moved more towards a model like theirs, they work a lot better than our current model. If you're willing to say that like Norway or Sweden or Finland are neoliberal, then I'm very happy to like work with you to get to your neoliberal end goal, because you're basically just a right-wing social democrat, or even just proper social democrat who's using the wrong labels at that point.
Private ownership, even if a few select industries are publicly owned. Since socialism is commonly defined as like a transitional state to communism being the goal, I'm going to focus on communism here. So why are neoliberals generally pro-free market and anti-communism is the question I want to answer.
So pro-free market, and so I would just say, as a market socialist, I do think that you can maintain markets and also have socialism. So I don't think that they are opposed. And also, it isn't markets versus communism. It would be like markets versus planning or markets versus gift economies. Virtually no one talks about gift economies except a few like niche anarchists. So usually the debate is between markets and planning. And as she notes, she is in favor of planning in some cases and not in others. So the question in short is, why should there be less planning and not more? Generally, socialists want more planning, both from the like state, and they also want more worker control. Those are the two main ones that are different. So one is on the market axis and one is on the worker control axis. They usually want more state planning than neoliberals would. And they also want more worker control, more unions, and more stuff like cooperatives, often with state support.
Philosophy is essential when it comes to ethics, but you can't just like think really hard to figure out empirical facts, right? Like when it comes to economics and economic policies, and
Austrians BTFO'd based neoliberal,
which actually work in practice, which result in a functioning system that promotes a GDP that's conducive to human well-being. You can think up an ethical...
just say an economy to well-being. I'm going to assume that's a slip up to be nice to her, but
system in which it is wrong for one person to ever profit off the work of another person. You can call that exploitation, but in order to put that into practice, you have to just not care about the consequences at all. You would have to ignore all of the times communism has been tried and all of the times it has failed, which is every single time it's been tried, it has failed. It has caused immeasurable suffering and death. I'm a consequence.
If your argument that planning is bad is that when they tried it in the USSR, it was bad, that really doesn't survive like the sort of modern democratic socialist sort of argument, which is generally that one, you need democracy to do planning, even if you want to do a planned economy. The analogy there would be someone like Paul Cockshott, who is an incredibly strong advocate for direct democracy and also an incredibly strong advocate for planning. He's extreme on both of those. The USSR, he correctly notes, was very undemocratic in those respects, and its planning was also extremely stupidly done, in part due to, I think, the lack of democratic pressures and the authoritarian state that ruled it and the military that dominated it and so on. But two, the empirical evidence here being like that when they tried it, it failed, is just such an incredibly weak argument because like virtually everyone critiques these sorts of plannings. I don't know. I guess that's kind of what I said before, but like even people like Paul Cockshott who support planning will critique that. His whole book, Towards a New Socialism, is basically a critique of old forms of planning and an explanation of how to do it better. Yeah, that's really stupid, and it also just doesn't work when you're talking to people who are like anarchists who don't really have examples that you can point to as being massive failures. Basically, all of the quote unquote failures of anarchist societies would be ones like Catalonia or like maybe the Black Army in Ukraine or something. And those failed due to military intervention, not like economic failure or something. So that doesn't work for them. And then for people who are more like democratic socialists or market socialists, they would just tell you, hey, look at what the best, most successful societies on earth are. And generally they tend to be ones which look like the model that we're trying to push towards, right? They're like in the direction of the model that we're trying to push towards. It seems like lower inequality tends to benefit people. It seems like stuff like public housing tends to benefit people. It seems like universal healthcare and so on tends to benefit people. I know these are just like social democratic policies. They aren't socialist policies, but it seems like when you go in that direction, things get better. So the empirical evidence there is not clearly in favor of like, hey, market's good. We should stay exactly where we are. I don't know. This is like the basic argument of people like Matt Bruenig and other sort of reformist socialists that like we can look at other societies that are to our left. They seem to be doing better than we are on those areas where they are to our left. So why not go left? And then the other thing that I was pointing out, so like in the conversation I had previously with Mixed about public housing, right? Like providing literally everyone public housing, you could say that that's like maybe if you're providing everyone public housing via vouchers, you could say that neoliberals are okay with that. But you're talking about an incredibly large redistributive state at that point. And generally, if we expand that sort of logic to a whole bunch of other things, it seems like you're talking about a really, really, really large state, which it's hard to ignore as like the role of planning. So like, for example, I pointed to the extreme success of so-called preventative housing or housing first in Finland, which has basically eradicated homelessness. The stats there, I guess since we didn't get too much into it with Mixed, let me go bring those up. Basically, the summary of the story of housing homelessness reduction in Finland is in 1987 they adopted a program to try and eradicate homelessness, and it started seeing a lot of successes using the old model called the staircase model, but then it started bottoming out around 1994. The staircase model was basically this idea that you'd get additional benefits as you went up the treatment steps. This is how like the World Economic Forum describes it. It's like you're on the street, well, you go to a night shelter, but to stay in that night shelter, you got to get clean. And then after, say, you're clean, you go to a hostel, but to stay in the hostel, you got to get a job. And then after you get a job, you go to a transitional housing unit. But to stay in the transitional housing unit, you got to do like an additional thing, like work with a social worker to make sure that you stay in that job and stay stable. And finally, you get to an independent apartment because you've like saved up enough money or the state has provided you a subsidy. This is like the classic staircase sort of model where it's means tested. We give you housing based on how well we think you're doing on like cleaning up your life sort of thing. And this worked for a whole lot of people who are homeless. But as this article, which I guess I'll link in chat for those who are interested, notes, about half of the people who are homeless could not be like, didn't see solutions from this. I will do the gaming. Oh my God, I promise I'll get there in just a moment. Please, relax. I love you all. This video will be quick. The basic thing, as this article notes, is that using the staircase approach, Finland halved homelessness, but progress showed. In particular, between 2004 and 2008, the number of single homeless individuals hovered between 7,400 and 7,960. Finland's annual homelessness reports attributed the stalled progress to a group of people with high support needs who were experiencing long-term homelessness analogous to chronic homelessness homelessness in the United States. Researchers suggested that the staircase approach can work well with those who opted for substance abuse rehabilitation and can cope with shared housing. However, the insistence on service users being intoxicant-free and able to take control of their lives has proven to be an insuperable, meaning unable to get over, barrier for many homeless people with multiple problems. If you want the simplest takeaway, think about it like this. The staircase model works for people who have, let's say, one problem. If you got one problem and it's like drug abuse or you lost your job or something, the staircase model can work for you because you've only got to solve one problem. But it turns out that when you've got a whole bunch of problems, it's really hard to solve those problems unless you have a house. And in fact, it's easier to solve those problems when you do have a house. So just providing people the house first helps them deal with all of those other problems. It reduces crime. It reduces the expense on social programs. There's a whole bunch of evidence that homelessness reduction programs actually reduces total government spending because it reduces police spending and reduces social service spending. Because these people who have a lot of problems are now safely at home and they have like reduced social needs and reduced social costs. So I guess the basic point that I would point to is there's a lot of evidence that it seems like you can go left clearly of even like the current Nordic model and still see substantial benefits. The basic take that I had in a previous conversation with Simey is we should experiment. We should go to social democracy at the minimum and then experiment with more left-wing policies, see what works, and then adopt those, like preventative housing. So if evidence-based policy is neoliberal and she's willing to support something like preventative housing, then be my guest, that's neoliberal too. Fucking 70% of the state GDP is spent via taxation on this sort of shit. Yeah, if you want to call that neoliberal, be my guest. We're all neoliberals now.
Pointillist. I care about
recap, her argument against socialism is that when we tried communism, it failed. So her argument against like democratic socialism is, but the USSR.
Consequences in terms of suffering. Most people care more about having a job, helping their family, than they do about some abstract principle that says it's wrong for their bosses to make a profit off of their labor. And I care more about what people want than I do deciding what people want for them or what.
Oh, this is an interesting thing. So while it is true that people do care more about their jobs and like having a basic income and so on, like that's just sort of objectively true. People care more about like the basic sustenance of life than they do about like more abstract things. We do also have a lot of evidence that people are alienated from work and that when you give people more control in management, they are substantially less alienated. I don't want the Marx quotes. I want... Yes, like this study, for example, found that there was a substantially reduced effect of alienation of people who felt like they were distanced from society and their coworkers when they had more involvement in management. And there's like lots of studies of this type, which I link quite a few in my stinky right-winger fact sheet. So no, people also do care about this, and there's no reason you shouldn't do both of these, right? You want to give people a job, which we can do, and you want to give them people a good type of job, which we can also do, a type of job where they have a workplace democracy.
What I think is better for them based on some sort of cosmic justice. Injustice in and of itself is not harm. It's only harm when the consequences of injustice actually harm people or sentient beings. And that harm...
Yeah, and alienation is a consequence and it hurts people. Done. Easy.
Harm can range from material harm, disease, lead in your water being shot, to immaterial harm like damaged self-esteem. There may be some level of
like alienation,
inevitable harm there when we're talking about capitalism. I'm sure there is, but that only matters if there is an alternative that is better. That if
yes, it's workplace democracy.
The harm that capitalism causes is worse than some sort of evidence-based alternative, but there is no evidence-based alternative, or there is one, but the evidence goes in the opposite direction. Talking about ending.
So this is the whole sort of thing. If the only evidence you look at for like more left-wing policy is like the USSR and you just point to it like falling apart, then like, yeah, there's evidence against it. But if you're willing to look at all the other evidence that say like inequality reduces growth, that's like say alienation and lack of workplace democracy alienates people and it hurts them psychologically, yeah, that's bad. And we can move in the direction of solving those with like workplace democracy and reduced inequality. We can also look at stuff like I pointed to with the preventative housing. It turns out that when the state intervenes in the housing market, it can actually improve people's lives and improve society overall. So yeah, we do have evidence for this kind of shit.
Wake up, liberal.
You might say that all of these things individually aren't socialist, but if you add all of them up, you get a picture that is very close to at least a very left-wing social democracy. And, you know, if you're willing to say like, oh, I'm only a left-wing social democrat, I'm not a socialist, you know, fucking be my guest. Okay, we're on board for 90% of like the political program for the next 20, 30 years.
Capitalism because of the inevitable harms without some solution, without something that actually works better, is like talking about ending food, because food on some level is inevitably harmful. True, but you know, maybe dying is worse.
I do actually agree with her very strongly on this point. There are a lot of people who will just say capitalism bad for this reason, but they won't present an alternative. You need to present an alternative to prove that your system does better. And it's easy to do so with this sort of evidence that I think you can easily find from existing policies today. Yeah, simple as.
Regulated capitalism with a strong safety net is the best system we have based on the systems we actually have evidence on, which is to say probably quite a bit more welfare than we currently have in the US. It's unreasonable to advocate for hypothetical alternatives when they range from untested to repeated failures. Again, you can't just reason out the ideal economic system for humans or for a particular country without evidence in practice. That's not being rational, it's not being scientifically minded, it's being dogmatic.
Technically, it is being rational by the definition of rationalism, meaning only starting from first principles, but I do agree that it's extremely unscientific and bad, and you should not do so. Okay, Austrians, shut the fuck up. People who want to reason because from something because Marx said it or your favorite anarchist thinker said it, no, that's stupid. Empirical evidence matters. Go follow Mal the Infidel and I's podcast, Evidence-Based Leftism. I will speed through the rest of this and then we'll do game, okay?
I've talked before about how not all use is abuse. The same goes for exploitation, which refers to unfair use. Some vegans say you can't be vegan unless you are socialist or communist, but there's nothing in the term or the definition that is anti-capitalist. So the argument is
you should never just appeal to the definition. I do agree that there's nothing inherently in veganism that is anti-capitalist, but it's not because that's how it's defined. That's just it's not like you should not appeal to the dictionary. You should say this is what it means, and it has no component bases of the basic meaning of the term, which lean to this. I don't want to critique her too much on this. This is semantic stuff.
Something like veganism means no exploitation. Exploitation is capitalism. Therefore, veganism means no capitalism. Two very big problems with.
I do agree with this, that just to say that you're vegan doesn't necessarily mean that you need to end capitalism. However, I do think that it lends credence. Generally, the arguments that exploiting animals is wrong do lend credence to the same arguments that exploiting humans are wrong. If you think it is wrong to coerce animals to do things that benefit you, you should also think that there's something wrong with coercing humans to do something just because it benefits you or benefits society. I do agree that you need to provide evidence that you have a better alternative, which is exactly what I tried to do repeatedly in the previous portions of this video.
This first, you have to accept the very specific Marxist definition of exploitation / capitalism, which is essentially begging the question when you define anti-exploitation as requiring Marxism because you've defined capitalism as inherently exploitative. I don't see any reason to accept this definition, the Marxist definition of exploitation. I think it's much better defined as unfair use, and what exactly that means is a lot more complex. Is there sometimes or even often exploitation in capitalistic systems? Of course. There are unambiguous cases, obvious cases of exploitation like wage theft and broken contracts. The same with animal agriculture. No choice is given to the animal, obviously, and obviously it's impossible for there to be any sort of fair exchange or any sort of deal made. So yeah, pretty
That's going to be the key word, free exchange. That's what she's posing non-exploitation as, but I'll let her finish.
Ambiguous exploitation. There's also a strong case to be made for exploitation in the breakdown of regulatory systems, like monopolies, but that doesn't mean we can't understand how to evaluate fair exchanges. Do we have a long way to go in creating a fairer market via regulation? Certainly. Arguably, we still struggle with monopolies, but that doesn't mean communism is the answer. Which brings me to the second problem. There is
Okay, so the basic note on exploitation, and I wanted to save it because I knew there'd be a whole section here. So you don't need to accept the specific Marxian view of exploitation via the labor theory of value to be a socialist. I frequently promote two books, one by Romer and one by Robinson, which I will link in chat. The one by Robinson is called Economic Philosophy. It was written in 1974. It is by Robinson, and the other one is Free to Lose, written in 1988 by Romer. So the basic theory of both of these is that not the basic theory, I think one of the overriding themes of both of these books is that you get something very close to a Marxian class analysis when you simply look at unequal wealth ownership and unequal capital ownership. The reason why it is possible to exploit laborers even in quote-unquote free trade is because there were unequal property relationships at the start. Someone started with capital and you did not. You were born, I mean most of you, and I'm sure there's some some bougie fucks in my audience. Most of us were born onto this earth with the only asset that we really have, our labor to sell. And so most of us are forced as a result of that to labor. Even though it is free in a certain sense of the word, we have no real alternative. And moreover, the more capital someone has, the less need that they have to labor, the less that they are in a similar situation to the rest of us. So the more they are close to being able to exploit others for their labor. This is more or less the theory that I promote. It's that the closer someone gets to owning enough capital that they don't need to labor, and that their main source of profits is from gains from capital, which are fundamentally based on other people laboring for you, the closer they are to a capitalist. And so to a large degree, I don't consider those to be justified. I think that limited wealth inequality, limited income inequality can very well be justified by productive differences between individuals, but it is extremely hard to argue that the amount of wealth inequality and income inequality that we see in current society is anything close to anything close to what is justified by the current economic system. There was a really neat study that I saw. I can go try and find it, but I don't have it on hand. That the difference between like highly producing and lowly producing workers in a given field is often on the order of 1 to 4 times. But the amount of inequality by like wages that you see in America and other countries is often the order of like 1 to 500 times for people at like the lowest and the highest levels. And the average CEO is paid like 250 times more than the average worker. I think it is not hard to argue for a little bit of inequality to motivate people, but it is very hard to argue for currently existing amounts of inequality, not only because on the macro level, it seems like from like a meta study that they reduce growth, like a 10% increase in inequality is correlated with about a 1.3% decrease in growth, but also because they hurt society. They hurt the average individual via increases of crime, increases of like social distrust, and then finally because of marginal utility of money. Each additional dollar to someone who's rich matters less, like as each additional dollar you get. Like an additional dollar to a millionaire is worth less than an additional dollar to someone who has $1,000, because an additional dollar doesn't buy that much more happiness. And so I guess the fundamental things that I would try and point to here are unequal wealth ownership. And this is a point that Romer makes. Let me go get the Yale. This is a really neat interview that Romer did with the Yale political science. What the fuck do you call it? Like department. Where he basically argues that if you relabel certain groups, certain actors in neoclassical economics, like the same sort of economics that I'm operating under the modern neoclassical synthesis, and therefore she's operating under as a neoliberal, you basically get Marxian class analysis. You don't need to believe in labor theory value to see that people are getting fucked over by some having all the wealth and some having none. It's really not that hard to understand.
No evidence for a practicable alternative. The reason we can say animal agriculture is wrong is because we have well-established alternatives. We know humanity can survive on a plant-based diet. We can grow plants, we can grow only plants, we can feed the world's population, and we can do it without animal products. We just need a shift in the market, one product instead of another. If there were evidence that veganism had the same catastrophic consequences that communism does, like we couldn't grow plants without manure, or we didn't know how to make B12, then we couldn't say animal agriculture is wrong. We couldn't advocate for its abolition because we would have no viable alternative, unless or until like clean meat were a thing. Morality is a
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't disagree too much with this section. If veganism did lead to like worldwide collapse, that would be pretty bad. Good thing it doesn't.
Product of choice. When it comes to dietary habits and food production, we have a choice, and we need to start making the right choice. When it comes to economics, the claim that we have a viable choice in communism just is not true. None of this means...
So I don't know whether she's just new to these terms, but usually you would say in socialism, because like communism is supposed to be this like post-scarcity utopia that you get to after 100 years of socialism or whatever. It's like nobody needs to work, everything is free, the robots do everything, no man needs to labor, everyone can choose whatever job they want. Clearly that's not what socialists are talking about in the modern day. Socialists in the modern day are talking about stuff like workplace democracy. They're talking about stuff like an increased state role in regulating and controlling markets. And they're talking about and state ownership correspondingly, and they're talking usually about substantially decreased inequality and substantially increased like spreading of wealth across society, and all of these things, as I noted, I do think have substantial evidence behind them.
Means that we shouldn't research economic theory and try to find something better, just like in the hypothetical can't be vegan world. Hopefully we would research how to make B12, how to farm without manure. What it does mean is that it's wrong to advocate for abolishing capitalism based on some hypothetical work and basically a leap of faith.
Again, I agree with that. Use empirics. Stop citing like old ass textbooks that don't have any solid evidence behind them, okay? Evidence good.
Vegan police, I don't like to tell people they're not vegan or fake vegan or anything like that. That said, I do think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan, at least currently. If we also mean the human animal, when we talk about animals in the definition of veganism, and clearly anti-capitalists do, otherwise human economics would be irrelevant, then cruelty to humans is not vegan. Trying to push an entire society...
Going to argue that socialism and communism is cruel, and therefore it is wrong because vegans want to reduce cruelty. I know this is going to be the entire argument. The basic problem with this is that socialists don't think that anti-capitalism increases cruelty, so they wouldn't think that this is a contradiction. She would, because she thinks so. And I think she's wrong because of all the evidence that I previously pointed to. Less equal societies tend to have a higher crime, which to me means more cruelty done to other people. Less equal societies tend to have higher poverty. They tend to have more human suffering. They tend to have higher alienation, right? In part due to lack of worker democracy and in part due to higher social distrust. All of these things cause harm, I think, to the human animal. But I would love to hear if she has any more nuanced takes than socialism hurts people.
Society into, at best, an unknown situation, putting countless livelihoods and lives at risk within that society based on personal ideological reasons, that's cruel. The desire to tear down, for no credible reason, any and all capitalistic systems without regard for the human suffering that has always inevitably resulted is cruel. I know the intent is not cruelty, and I'm not saying intent doesn't matter. It does when we're talking about, someone's personal character. But look, when we're talking about animal agriculture, the intent isn't cruelty there either. The intent is to produce a product and to make money. It's the outcome which is harmful, and the indifference to the outcome which is cruel.
So I would actually agree with this. I do not think. I said that from an anti-capitalist perspective, they don't think that it's causing cruelty. She says, well, their intent doesn't matter, the outcomes do, and she thinks that the outcomes are cruel. Great, but again, the problem is the anti-capitalist and the anti-capitalist vegan also thinks that that anti-capitalism has good outcomes. They think that they have evidence of that. So again, this just doesn't work unless you already buy her premise that anti-capitalism causes suffering. So I don't think she's added any new arguments here other than that anti-capitalism causes suffering.
I don't think intent is any excuse in the face of overwhelming evidence of harm, and ideological blindness to that harm is no excuse. And going back to the second part of the definition of veganism, by extension promotes...
I guess I should get my tiny little jab in here, okay? So there was a really neat IMF paper that I was reading I want to say earlier this morning, which demonstrated that the IMF had been blinded to the downsides of austerity politics. For about 30 years, the IMF had been pushing austerity as a solution to governments overspending. And they had hugely underestimated the impact that austerity spending had on economies. Basically, they underestimated what's called the Keynesian multiplier. How much additional growth do you get from $1 of government spending? And they'd estimated it to be pretty low, but in fact, it's really, really high. So when you really cut government spending, as they encourage countries to do in the wake of the Great Depression, it actually really, really stunts growth. And so you don't want that. Good Keynesian spending is the kind of stuff that gets the country back on track economically, and that actually increases long-run growth. Or at least that's the strong Keynesian claim. The weaker Keynesian claim is at least that it reduces human suffering in the short term, which seems like a good thing. So, ideological blindness back on you.
And going back to the second part of the definition of veganism, by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. So no part of veganism as a moral choice makes any sense outside of a standard economic model of supply and demand. Without capitalism, eating plant-based is just symbolic. Promoting personal consumer actions and boycotts and alternatives as morally meaningful makes no sense. The presumption of a capitalistic context, a capitalistic society, is part of the definition of veganism. A denial of capitalism or opting out of capitalism in principle, not only does this make vegan ethics irrelevant, it fails to do good in the most cogent way that veganism acts on the world, by changing production. It's a failure to be vegan in any sense.
So most socialists, like I said at the beginning, like Paul Cockshott, advocate for an enormous increase of democracy. The goal of vegan public advocacy there would be to get people to change their minds, change the way they vote, and vote for a reduced meat production, vote for a reduced milk production and dairy production and so on. So I think all of these things are entirely compatible with the democratic form of socialist production. If you want to talk to authoritarians who don't believe in that, maybe that's a valid argument, but the vast majority of socialists believe in democracy. I've in fact argued, and this is more of a revisionist Marxist view, that Marx, to some degree, and most socialists thereafter, have inherited liberalism. The creators of liberalism extended democracy to the political sphere. Socialists simply want to extend democracy to the economic sphere. Socialists feel the average person has too little control over the economy. They want more prosperity for more people rather than a few people generally controlling where most resources go, or the market deciding that only a few people are worthy of receiving a large amount of resources.
From ethical principle to consequence. So again, I'm not going to call vegans who happen to be anti-capitalist not vegans, but the ideology of anti-capitalism seems inherently at odds with veganism, at least for now.
So her two arguments, one, were that socialism hurts people, and that's bad because vegans don't want to hurt people because people are animals, and vegans don't want to hurt animals. That's true, but only if you think that socialism hurts people, which is something that socialists obviously don't believe. And then her second argument was that in a social system, you would not be able to do stuff like consumer advocacy, which I think just falls apart if you believe in anything close to a democratic system, which virtually every flavor of socialism believes in, except the weird niche ones and basically authoritarians, which most other people hate. I don't know. This just feels like an incredibly weak argument. Yeah, that's really all I have to say. I don't think there's much more to say. Video done. Game time. Can I get the link for the IMF thing? Oh yeah, one moment. IMF Keynesian multiplier. This might come up. Yeah, it's this one. It was a It was Blanchard 2013. Oops. Basically, as they write, we find that in advanced economies, stronger planned fiscal consolidation, meaning austerity, has been associated with lower growth than expected, with the relation being particularly strong early in the crisis, which is what you'd expect if the Keynesian multiplier is large. A natural interpretation is that the fiscal multipliers, the Keynesian multipliers, were substantially higher than implicitly assumed by forecasters, who were mostly working under these quote-unquote neoliberal or like less left Keynesian model. So I think that there's a whole bunch of research on the importance of state spending on propping up economies. That's it.